Tonight's webinar is Bending Toward Justice, Teaching Voting Rights and Representation with iCivics and We the People. My name is Mark Gage. I'm the Director of Publishing for the Center for Civic Education, and I'll be serving as the facilitator of this event. We have three very special presenters tonight: Mike Fassold, Henry L. Chambers, and Emma Humphries. Now, a little bit about each of them. Our scholar for tonight's webinar is Professor Henry L. Chambers, Jr. Professor Chambers is the Austin E. Owen Research Scholar and Professor of Law at the University of Richmond School of Law. He teaches and writes in the areas of constitutional law, criminal law, law and religion, and employment discrimination. Professor Chambers served as Special Assistant Attorney General for Redistricting Matters for the Commonwealth of Virginia from 2011 to 2013. He has been involved with We the People as a content scholar and judge at the local and national level for over 2 decades. Emma Humphries is the Chief Education Officer at iCivics and the Deputy Director of Civics Now. In this dual role, she serves as iCivics' pedagogical expert and supports the Civics Now Coalition's mission to improve and expand civic education and advance equity. Emma earned her PhD in curriculum and instruction from the University of Florida, with an emphasis in civics. And Mike Fassold has been a junior high teacher for 24 years after retiring from the United States Air Force in 1995. He has taught social studies methods at Anderson University and high school history and government. Mike has been involved with the We the People, the Citizen, and the Constitution program for over a decade as a unit advisor for 2 different high school teams, and then started a middle school team 7 years ago using the We the People curriculum. Over the last 4 years, his team has competed in the We the People National Invitational Challenge, winning 3 national championships with 1 runner-up. And with that, thank you very much, everyone. I will turn it over to Mike Fassold. Mike, over to you. Sorry, Mike, you're...
No problem. Give me a second to share my screen.
Go right ahead. There you go. We are seeing your screen.
It's odd in this kind of presentation format because I've been teaching virtual now since last March, and I'm used to seeing a bunch of junior high faces, and I see no one's face except for Mark's. All right, so that will make it a little weird for me.
Well, we're all listening, Mike, so.
I appreciate that.
There you go.
I actually teach 7th grade world history. I have 6 classes of that, and I teach 1 8th grade class. And it's a U.S. history, government. I am their social studies teacher, but I base it on the We the People program. You can tell by my school pictures, I am meant to teach junior high. My 8th grade Weeples are under this We the People program. This is them being mean to me, by the way, at our first time at Nationals. They all showed up with t-shirts with my face on them. The heart and soul of the We the People program, and I wanted to just make one pitch for this. I've taught for a long time. The thing that makes We the People special is, for those of us out there that are actual teachers, it is the truest authentic assessment program in the country as far as I'm concerned. I mean, History Day, those type of things. But if you want a true authentic assessment to what your kids know, this program has it. And the authentic assessment part comes when they either compete in-house or at the regional, state, national level, with sitting across from judges who get a chance to listen to what your kids have worked on and prepared for, and then they take 6, 7, 8 minutes of follow-up questions where they've got to stand on their own 2 feet and they've got to show what they know. And that's what initially attracted me to the program, and it's what kept me in, and actually had me start a program in my late 50s. Units are broken up. This is a COVID year, as you can imagine, so I'm not even, some of my kids on my team I've never met in person. So we normally do unit stickers, and this is our unit stickers. We cover everything from the basic ideas of government to basically citizenship responsibilities. We break down the history and government part of our country. The thing that I really like about the We the People program is it allows us to dig in all these non-controversial subjects, right? Immigration, electoral college, voting limits, citizenship. My kids are working on a paper right now asking whether or not we should have citizenship tests to vote. We deal with things like presidential powers. We have to know the history of it. Have we gone too far? Have we not gone far enough? You know, we look at political parties and study everything from the factional advice that was given in the Federalist Papers to George Washington's farewell address to right now. And so this is a lesson I actually have taught my kids already. I just changed a couple words, but basically I wanted to give my kids the history of voting rights in America as a teaser. And so you ask how I can possibly engage a bunch of 14-year-olds who literally know very little about government coming in. Well, I use emotion and rage. And I start out giving a little background in 1788 America. Give or take 2.4 million free inhabitants, 600,000 slaves. Washington is elected basically with 43,782 votes, which is 1.8% of the free inhabitants. Normally I would ask my students this, and I've done this presentation with a college, and I asked them, let's go ahead and take a look to see who it is, that could vote today. And so I asked them to mute their screen if they're over 21. Now in 7th grade, that's everybody. All right. Then I have them mute their screen if they're not male. I have them mute their screen if they're not white. I have them mute their screen if they don't own more than 50 acres of land. It'd be interesting in the chat if anyone could tell me if they would still be eligible to vote. And then I start a timeline. And the one thing about We the People, because of the depth part of it, we're kind of able to play around with some harder concepts. And in 1789, by and large, grants the power to set voter requirements basically to the states. At the state level, with some exceptions here and there, it was mainly just white men over 20 who owned land. But one of the things that I want my kids to know is who gets left out. And so my little pictures down there, of course, are, free blacks, Native Americans, women, and of course, merchants that don't own more than 50 acres of land. And I ask, where did they get the land requirement from? And then there's always this pause, and then they're able to figure out it connects back to our kind of our European roots, right? The roots in England that those who had say had to own property. And we've already discussed by this point the role that property played when it comes to power, and then you see that from 1792 until the early 1800s, you had some free blacks that were able to vote, but they would lose their right to vote in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. One of the things I like to do, and what my kids kind of learn from, is that we kind of like to attack stereotypes of political narratives. Like this idea that the only place that there was any sort of suppression of rights was only occurring, in the South. And then we deal with the elimination of property. That was a slow, gradual thing, right? From white men, of course. Starting in 1792 in Kentucky, up until 1856 in North Carolina. And you see this push and realization of this Jeffersonian, Jacksonian democracy. But this elimination of property, we have a tendency to want to look at this to still, who does it leave out? And then, of course, who gains from this? And then I kind of, we jump to the 14th Amendment, and it says, citizenship is guaranteed to all male persons born and naturalized in the United States. And we talk about how this sets the stage for the expansion of voting rights down the road, but it still kind of leaves out some folks. And then the 15th Amendment basically denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but still we have left out. We have people that are left out of the process. Now, just as an aside, I have 24 eighth graders. In my 24 eighth graders, I have 17 girls. So every time this little suffragette picture comes up, they grr. And that's where the grr actually comes from. And then, of course, the 15th Amendment is going to have a pushback. And of course, you're going to see the emergence of poll taxes, literacy taxes, grandfather clauses, Jim Crow laws, black codes. And what that does is it seeks to, once again, disenfranchise the enfranchisement. And of course, in literacy tests, I'd like to ask the question to most people, does anyone know what the first state was to use literacy tests? And everyone guesses the South. But of course, I believe the first literacy test was actually used in Connecticut. And then I don't like to skip over this court case. And if you've never looked at this, this is fascinating. It's Minor v. Happersett in 1875. And what this case does is it says women are citizens. It acknowledges that in 1875 that women are really citizens. It kind of puts that to rest. But citizenship does not require the right to vote. And if you read the majority opinion written by Chief Justice Morrison Waite, it's fascinating because there's a line there where he says the Constitution of the United States did not explicitly give citizens an affirmative right to vote. And I like to ask my kids of whether or not he's right. And then I like the fallback from that because then I use this to introduce the concept of the difference between fair, right, and just, using Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail as my kind of anchoring text. Then we get to the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which is also timely. Because, the ratification occurs, 100 years ago this year. But when I ask my kids, does that then mean that all women in our country could vote? And when I explained to them, it did not guarantee African-American women a bypass of state voting restrictions. And then, of course, I cover the Native Americans receiving, grants the right to vote to Native Americans. It is a slower process. As late as 1948, there were still 2 states that were heavy disenfranchisement locations for Native Americans. And of course, I used to live in New Mexico. I was stationed there, and you can understand it because there's a significant population of Native Americans. And so you can see that this would threaten people in power at the time. Then we get to 1943, where as part of the Magnuson Act, Chinese immigrants were given the right to citizenship and the right to vote. Now, I pull this aside with my kids because I use this to introduce the idea of why is there fear of immigrants in our country. And then, of course, we take a look a little bit at Chinese immigration and look at the Chinese Exclusion Act, those type of things. And then I like to ask questions inside of these. And one of the questions I asked, I wanted them to understand how do poll taxes disenfranchise? And then, of course, in 1964, the 24th Amendment banned poll taxes in federal elections. And this is, and you're going to really enjoy our the scholar a little bit later. Him and I had a long discussion about Shelby v. Yoder. But anyway, the Voting Rights Act itself is what basically made concrete an African-American woman's right to vote. And we're talking 1965. The Shelby v. Holder case, I understand the parts of this ruling. There's a part that I don't understand, and I disagree with some people on it. I will throw out personal opinion here. I think it's a terrible ruling. because of what protections and then the aftermath of the reduction of those protections occurred. And then, of course, most of you, I'm just assuming, are younger than Bob Lemon and I that are in here. And so you guys probably don't really have firsthand knowledge of the Vietnam war that Bob and I probably do. That when I was in high school, the war actually ends. And so we talk about the background of this very quickly passed amendment that lowered the voting age to 18, dealing with why it was that this was important. And I set up the question of, should everyone who pays state, local, and federal taxes have the right to vote? Lastly, then we explore, are we leaving still people out? We look at felon disenfranchisement. We look at, should resident aliens be allowed to vote in local elections where they pay taxes and their kids go to the schools? And then, of course, I posit the idea, should 16-year-olds be allowed to vote, especially if they have a job and they pay taxes? I would highly recommend to all of you that don't have any time available to somewhere put into your queue to read this book by Ari Berman. It's foundational for me in the teaching of the history of voting rights and to bring it into modern times. And I'm not paid on commission by Ari Berman, and he doesn't even know I'm alive, though I think I own like 12 copies of his book that I give out to people. But I would highly recommend to put this on your summer reading. It's fascinating. And for those of us that are in love with the idea of teaching civics, I can't recommend this enough to you. And now this is the part where I have questions. And Mark was unsure of whether or not I could actually finish in 15 minutes.
I had
and
complete
I put a timer in front of me, and I did.
You are a teacher. I have, I have complete faith in your ability to manage your time.
I don't, Mike. I get caught all the time by the bell.
Well, let's see. Faye made one of our attendees, Faye, made two great points, and one of those was that women in New Jersey actually had the right to vote temporarily, and then lost it.
Yes.
Does that make any of the female members of your classroom feel gurish?
They ask the question, why? And of course, and for those of us that teach civics, when you look at that discussion, you have to kind of tie this with what was going on in our country when they lose this. And it's a fascinating discussion to look at what's called small r republicanism, where you have this revival in our country that we need to go back in the early 1800s, that we need to go back to traditional small r republicanism things. The woman is at home, she provides for the children, she takes care of that part, and anything outside of that arena was considered outside their sphere. And so you see this reduction of women's rights until, of course, we start pushing west. And once we start pushing west, you're going to see an expansion of rights for women, because a lot of the women that pushed out there were side by side with men. And you see like a rise in women's ability to vote out west. But out in the east, not so much.
Mm-hmm. And then she was interested that you started your, she thought it was a great way to start the conversation with kids that, states had the power to create voting requirements. So that's the way the Constitution is organized, right? It's that's the way the amendments are written.
Well, and of course, we hearken to the Constitution all the time. I mean, and so what we do is we go in there and I have them, we start our year with kind of like breaking down the Constitution into categories, and one of them is voting. And so we establish everything that deals with voting, from the Electoral College to age requirements to everything. Because what I want them to understand is you don't see a national mandate out there and requirements for voting, which then of course leads it to the states.
And I'm interested in, you mentioned that you had brought up with your students the issue of should 16-year-olds be able to vote.
Sure.
So what do your kids say? I'm interested in knowing.
You mean by civically educated,
You're civically,
powerfully
yeah.
opinionated,
Yeah.
protesting redheaded girls who go out and protest downtown? They think they should be able to vote.
Interesting.
They say they know enough to vote. And I'll paraphrase what they tell you. They will say the decisions that are being made by a bunch of old people that will never see the ramifications of those decisions infuriates them because they feel like there is a mess being made that their generation will have to clean up. And they feel that burden is unfair.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for that, Mike. That was a fascinating discussion. And we do have, I just want to let people know that we do have a lesson that goes along with this. I'm actually going to share my screen here pretty soon. Let's see. You should be seeing a middle school book. Are you seeing a middle school book? I hope so.
Yes.
Okay. Let me just page down. If you're seeing, so Mike teaches using the We the People middle school book, and we have 2 free sample lessons. This is on the executive branch, and this one right here, I'm just going to open it up, is on, it's lesson 25, and it is on the right to vote being expanded since the adoption of the Constitution. So if you go, I'm going to put this in the chat, actually, this link right here in the chat. If you go here, you can download this free lesson and teach this in your classroom tomorrow if you want. Probably not tomorrow. You probably want to give it a read first. But anyway, just to let you know. And with that, we will turn it over to Hank Chambers. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you for your presentation. We really appreciate it. Hank, over to you.
Hello, folks. I have 30 minutes to talk with you all, and I will hit some issues. I will mention some stuff that jumps off of what Mike had to say, and we'll see how far we get. I tell folks that I'm always just an email away. That's because I'm always just an email away. So a couple things that pop up that got us started. The focus on states being the entities that are allowed to determine voting rules is actually quite important. And it's something that oftentimes even my students don't really have a grasp on until I hit them over the head with it a couple of times. The idea that states can decide, generally speaking, or at least historically have been able to decide who gets to vote is actually quite important. As has been noted in the chat, whether it's Pennsylvania, New Jersey, had allowed women to vote for some amount of time and then decided to back off. North Carolina did the same thing, allowed free blacks to vote and then backed off of that. That's important. One of the reasons why it's important is because if you think about the concept of free citizens, although the Dred Scott decision makes us wonder whether there are free blacks, at least from the Supreme Court's perspective, but the idea that there have been free blacks in America since its founding is actually something that can be a surprise to kids. But when you start to think about the voting piece of the puzzle and who was allowed to vote and who wasn't allowed to vote, it makes folks ask, well, who's a part of this thing we call America? And you get to a couple of places where there are folks who argue the mere fact that you don't have a right to vote doesn't mean that you're not a part of this thing called America. That's very hard for a lot of folks to understand, in part because it's so foreign to what we think of today. That is, when we think about citizenship, we oftentimes think about voting. When we think about what it is that citizens do that allow them to interact with the government, voting is the place where we go, which in some ways is a positive, in some ways is a negative. A positive because it can get folks out there to vote, a negative because there are so many other ways that people are supposed to interact with the government in order to make the government their own. So I say that to say there is a rich vein that's out there in terms of thinking about states and thinking about the ability of states to determine who votes, and then over time recognizing that the Constitution limits states and how they can limit who gets the right to vote. So in that vein, it's always reasonable to ask the question, as Mike asked of his students, do we really want everyone to vote? That is to say, historically, have we wanted everyone to vote? And even today, given the people who aren't allowed to vote in some states, do we want everyone to vote? In terms of groups, we can certainly think of felons or ex-felons, depending on where you're talking about. You can think about the concept that Maine and Vermont allow currently incarcerated people to vote. On the flip side, you have other states that don't allow folks to vote even after they've served their entire term of imprisonment and probation, et cetera. So it's an interesting question on that issue. States still have different rules on who can vote. But even to the side of who can vote, how folks are allowed to vote is a big question. What I mean by that is, if we honestly want everyone to vote, and we want to make sure that everyone can vote, we might think about some of the rules that limit whether people can cast a ballot. So for example, registration rules, voter ID rules, rules that stop folks from casting ballots either on election day or before election day, can make us think about the question, are we trying to make sure that everyone, one, can vote, and two, that everyone who is allowed to vote has the easiest chance to vote? And not surprisingly, we've heard an awful lot about that issue during this election cycle as various folks attempt to put barriers in front of people, some of which they say are legit, some of which really are not, to stop folks from at least being able to cast a ballot in a particular situation or circumstance. So, okay, that question, let's put that question to the side for a bit, and let's now assume that we want people to vote. So it raises this issue. Who gets to vote? And how do we figure out who gets to vote? Well, let's take a step back and think about the census when we talk about who gets to vote and how they get to vote. So let me share my screen with you all. Let me go to our PowerPoint. I'm not a big PowerPoint guy, and as you all will see with some of my slides, I break pretty much every PowerPoint rule in terms of too many words and things along those lines, but hey, I don't care. That's all right. So fine. That's our basic title page. Let's go to the next slide. The census. Tons and tons of words. Why? Because I want us to remember where the census comes from. Now, I know we all know where the census comes from, but I just want us to remember. What we want to remember is the census is done in order to set representatives for Congress. Now, why do we hesitate with that? Because it has no other specific purpose from a constitutional perspective. So we get this language out of Article 1, Section 2. The actual enumeration, talking about the census, shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States and within every subsequent term of 10 years in such manner as they shall by law direct. Congress responsible for the census. Until such enumeration shall be made, the state of New Hampshire shall be entitled to choose 3, Massachusetts 8, Rhode Island and Providence Plantations 1, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The point of the census, right, the point of the census was to determine what number of representatives each state would have in Congress, right? A very limited purpose for the census. So the question becomes, well, what do we use the census for today? We use it for many, many more things than that. It's a way of figuring out, in some ways, what's fair. If we count the number of people in every state, in every city, then what we can do is then allocate resources and other things to people based on the numbers of folks who were in states. Now, we recognize that when the federal government was relatively small, that wasn't necessarily an issue. The federal government worried about taking money in and spending it on grand, broad projects, not necessarily sending money directly back to the people. But now that our federal government is doing something a bit different, you at the very least need to know, well, where do people live? Right? If you're talking about sending funds, for example, to school districts, you need to know who's in what school districts and how many people are there. So when we think about the census, yes, it is required for a narrow purpose under the Constitution, but it's used for a much broader purpose, and therefore we have to think about why we, or at least how we count people and who ought to be included, which has triggered some real issues with the 2020 census. Problems with this census in 2020. The point of the census is to take a snapshot as of a certain day regarding how many people are in the United States and where they happen to live and exist. So what are some of the problems? Well, one is COVID-19. Right? The notion is we don't have quite as much interaction with each other as we've had in the past. So as a consequence, it may well be the case that trying to count people as of a date certain is particularly difficult. Right? Second issue, which is a different one, is who do we want to count? Lots of discussion about should we count undocumented people or no? Question about should we only ask about citizens, or should we ask a question on the census about citizenship status? A couple issues pop up. One, right, is that when we talk about enumeration and allocating and apportioning seats to states, we talk about population, not just about citizens. That is, historically, the notion has been we're going to talk about the population and not just citizens. The second problem, if you ask about citizenship, the concern is that many people who are not citizens, and even some who are, will likely not answer questions and therefore be ignored by the census. That triggers an inaccurate count and an inaccurate enumeration, which itself is problematic. So what we tend to see is if the government really wants to count as many people as possible, it takes one set of rules. If it doesn't necessarily want to count everyone, then it takes a different set of rules. I'm not talking about what's fair and what's not fair. I'm just saying how we count people. And remember, like I say, we're talking about counting people for purposes of enumeration, for purposes of allocating congressional seats to states, but also now for purposes of how you spend money, issues along those lines. So the obligation is to get the census correct. Right? So get the census correct and then use those numbers to figure out where folks are going to live, things along those lines. Okay, so that's a really quick issue with the census. We all recognize what the census is supposed to do. Now, how does this necessarily relate to the question of teaching voting rights, issues along those lines? Well, all right. One of the things that we tend to think about in terms of apportionment and allocation is building districts and the idea of one person, one vote. So we need to go back when we start thinking about one person, one vote, and think about where it came from. So let's go back to our screen and see what our PowerPoints and see what we have here. We think about one person, one vote. All right, let's advance it. The issue is malapportionment. Now, until we got into the 1960s, we didn't require one person, one vote. So in fact, here is a piece from Reynolds versus Sims, which along with Baker versus Carr essentially ushered in the one person, one vote era. This is, like I say, language from Reynolds versus Sims. They're talking about senatorial districts in Alabama. And in Alabama, each county had one Senate seat for the Alabama State Senate. So with respect to senatorial apportionment, since the pertinent Alabama constitutional provisions had been consistently construed as prohibiting the giving of more than one Senate seat to any one county, Jefferson County, which is where Birmingham is, with over 600,000 people, was given only one senator, as was Lowndes County with a 1960 population of only 15,417, and Wilcox County with only 18,739. So we're talking about one county with 30 times as many people as another county getting the same number of representatives. The notion is that's malapportionment. That is unfair because the idea is that the Constitution requires that citizens have equally weighted votes. So also from Reynolds versus Sims, 1964, however you're going to decide who gets to vote says whatever the means of accomplishment, the overriding objective must be substantial equality of population among the various districts so that the vote of any one citizen is approximately equal in weight to that of any other citizen in the state, coming out of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. Well, a couple things have to pop up to us at this point. One is we say, well, okay, hold on a second. We understand that we want to give people an equally weighted vote. That seems only fair if we're going to treat people equally. But how does that work with our United States Senate? And the answer, of course, is it doesn't. So here is a population estimate. I realize it's not directly from the Census Bureau, and for that I apologize, but here it is. Remember that each state in the US gets 2 senators. So we don't want to pick on Wyoming, but Wyoming is at the bottom in terms of population. Wyoming has about, and I apologize that the edge is cut off, had about 573,000 people, and they got 2 senators. California, largest state, has about 40 million people in it, and it gets 2 senators as well. I point this out to suggest or to note that even in a democracy or a supposed democracy like we have some voting rules embedded in the Constitution that suggest that we're not always going to think in democratic ways. We require states' houses of their legislatures to be apportioned consistent with one person, one vote, but we don't require it of the US Senate. And the reason why is because the US Senate is explicitly written into the Constitution as a body where every state has equal population. That can be a little difficult for folks to handle. It can be a little bit difficult and troubling for some of my students to handle. I just tell them, if the Constitution requires something, then you have to keep it. If it doesn't require something, then we may go to what we consider to be a fairness notion. So, all right, one person, one vote, that means that people have to have equally weighted votes. So what does that mean for how we build districts? Well, what I want us to think about first is, do we need to have districts at all? And arguably the answer is not necessarily. That is, if we wanted to not have districts, we could vote at large. That is, we could say, no matter how many people you have running for a position, or how many people you have running, you just stick them in there and you vote without districts. Now, that raises some interesting questions. And here, let me give you a notion of at-large voting. Right? At-large voting means no districts, but the voting rules may still lead to interesting or somewhat problematic results. Why? Well, if we're talking about representation and we're talking about at-large voting, go with me here. It turns out that if each voter can cast as many votes as positions to be elected, then 51% of the electorate can select all of the representatives. You may say, whoa, how is that possible? Well, here's how. Let's assume we have 100 voters with 3 votes each, because there are going to be 3 positions to be elected. If 51% of the electorate votes for the same 3 candidates, those candidates have to win, because there aren't enough votes left over for any of the other candidates to get more than 51 votes. And you may say, whoa, but we still have 49 voters with 3 votes each. That's right, but they have to use 1 vote on each position. So the most that any of those other folks can get, if 51% of the electorate votes for the same 3 candidates, the most any of those other candidates can get are 49%. Or at least 49 votes. So what that means is that you could very well have no districts. You could give everyone the same number of votes, but you could still have a bare majority control the entire legislature. I raise that because even after, that means that even after we decide one person, one vote is the rule, you can still have folks messing around with the election results, right, by looking at numbers and at large. So that's one piece. Here's the second piece when we think about at large voting. If you limit the number of votes that folks can cast, you might be able to change the way that folks are selected. Now, I realize that there's a little bit of math here, and you may say, hey, I didn't come here for the math, I came here for the civics. That's okay. We're going to combine the two. So here, let's assume we have an at-large voting situation where each voter can cast one vote. So let's assume that we have 100 voters, each of whom can cast one vote. Again, 3 positions to be elected. Now remember, with our last example, 51% of the folks could elect all 3. Here, because each voter is limited to one vote, we have a different outcome. Any candidate who receives 26 votes is assured election, because the worst the candidate can finish is 3rd place. And you may say, well, hold on a second. How's that possible? This is how. Right? You have 100 voters. A candidate who receives 26 votes, that means there are only 74 votes remaining. It's impossible for 3 candidates to get 26 votes if there are only 74 votes out there. That means that a smaller group of people, 26%, can guarantee that they get someone who they like to represent them in this 3-person legislature. Is that important? You better believe it's important, because what it suggests is that now we're going to make sure that folks not only can cast a vote, but that they can actually have a say in the legislature, right? Just recognize there's been a fight over at-large voting for many years, right? Because some folks want to use at-large voting to allow bare majorities to control a substantial proportion of a legislature, and others want to use a different form of at-large voting to make sure that minority groups, or that is numerical minorities, may be able to have some voice in the legislature. These are issues that are not obvious, but they're issues that your students absolutely can understand. So that's the at-large voting piece. The piece that oftentimes drives people a little nuts, however, is not a situation where you have at-large voting, but a situation where you have districts and redistricting. And what happens when we talk about districts and redistricting is that we have to deal with the question of apportionment. So what do we think, or what are we thinking about when we talk about apportionment? When we talk about apportionment, we're talking about dividing a jurisdiction into districts so that we can provide common representation to those districts. It sounds easy, but it's not necessarily so easy. Think about your classroom. Think about your classroom. Let's assume you have, let's say, 30 students in your classroom. And let's assume that they're going to elect 3 representatives to student council. You could have an at-large election, but let's assume that you want to district it. Question you ask is, how would you divide the kids in your class into 3 districts? Right? Would you have the kids in the back have their own district, and then have sort of the kids in the left front and the right front have a district? Or would you just divide the class in thirds? Right? That's the question that we ask when we talk about districting. How do we do it? We know that because of one person, one vote, each district has to have a basically equal number of people in it. But how you draw the lines, that's where the fun really starts, or where the problems start. So what are some of the notes? What are some of the what's the nature of redistricting, and how do we decide how to draw those lines? Well, in theory, we want to draw those lines. Well, I won't say in theory. Courts have largely suggested, and states have largely suggested, that you draw lines by having compact districts of contiguous territories that generally respect political subdivisions and tend to provide communities of interest with common representation. So the notion is you want to put likes together into a district in order to allow them to elect someone to represent them. That's the notion. Now, we can have a fight about that. That is, we may say, whoa, 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 we don't want people who are like one another to be in a district. No, no, no. We want people who are different from one another to be in a district so that they have to come together to decide who's going to represent them. Right? That's where a lot of the fun and a lot of the fight sort of pops up and interesting things occur. Right? That's also in some ways where gerrymandering can start. Why? Because someone has to draw the maps. Somebody has to draw the districts. And what you can do when you're drawing districts, if you want to be nefarious about it, is you can draw them in ways to make sure that your team wins, even in situations where your team arguably shouldn't win. So let's take a look at an example, theoretical example of possible gerrymandering, one which is a really hardcore gerrymander, and one is a little softer. I say a little softer. Some people would say all forms of gerrymandering are rough, but nonetheless, let's take a look. So here is the most, what I would call the hardest core of the gerrymander, the extreme gerrymander. Let's assume we have a jurisdiction of 1,000 voters, 10 districts with 100 voters each. Let's assume we have 400 blues and 400 reds. If map makers can draw 6 districts with 60 blues, the blues, who are a numerical minority, can control the legislature. Now, you may say, how is that possible? Well, if the blues live together and the reds live together, then it may be fairly easy to draw districts that have 60 blues in them. And you may say, well, okay, let me make sure the numbers work out. Well, 6 districts with 60 blues, that's 360 blues. So you still have 40 blues to put in the other 4 districts. Now, in the other districts, right, because in a district with 60 blues, there are going to be 40 reds, right? So in the 6 districts with 60 blues and 40 reds, you're going to have 240 reds in those 6 districts. That means you have 360 reds to fit in the other 4 districts. In other words, the districts that are run by the blues are going to be largely blue. The districts that are run by the reds are going to be overwhelmingly red. If you can draw an extreme gerrymander like this, a numerical minority may be able to control the legislature for a fair amount of time. And that's a problem. It's a problem if we believe that majorities ought to govern. Now, that's an extreme gerrymander. What about a slightly less extreme gerrymander? Slightly less extreme gerrymander, 1,000 voters, 10 districts of 100 voters each. Now we're assuming that the blues are 520 and the reds are 480. So the blues are a slight majority. But what if the map makers, again, get a chance to draw districts, 7 districts with 60 blues in them? The blues are a slight numerical majority, so we don't have a problem with the blues governing, but they're going to have an overwhelming and likely durable majority in the legislature. Remember, they have 7 60-40 districts, which means that they have control over 70% of the districts. So what they've done is they have leveraged their majority into what amounts to a supermajority that allows them to control a legislature far in excess of their actual power in that jurisdiction. That's really what gerrymandering is about. That's the harm of gerrymandering. That's the problem with gerrymandering, right? And at the end of the day, that is the problem. Of course, you can put whatever party you want on blues and reds, doesn't really matter. That's the notion of partisan gerrymandering, and that partisan gerrymandering is what the Supreme Court said is not unconstitutional. They said that just last year. So they've left it to the states to figure out how to deal with gerrymandering on their own. And it's been quite interesting to see how some states dealt with gerrymandering years ago and how states are dealing with gerrymandering now. A number of states have suggested independent or bipartisan map drawing commissions, and we'll see what happens with those. In Virginia, we have a bipartisan redistricting commission that is on the ballot in November. We'll see what happens with that. So I have just a couple minutes left. I want to show you what I won't say what gerrymandering looks like, but what an interesting form of districting looks like. Here, let's go to a different part of my screen. Here we're going to go to, oh, well, this actually is a clip from West Side Story, the song America. We're not going to play it here, in part because I think copyright says we can't play it, although I'd love to play it. The reason why I show this to my class is because it actually gets at Puerto Ricans in New York in 1960. Why does that matter? It matters because literacy tests in New York were actually quite problematic for Puerto Ricans who moved there because, of course, the literacy tests were in English and they spoke Spanish. So there actually is a piece of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that addresses that specific issue and calls New York to task about their literacy tests, and in fact tells New York you cannot have a literacy test in Spanish. Sorry, you can't have a literacy test that stops folks who speak Spanish and went to American flag schools in Puerto Rico through grade 6. You can't have a test that stops them from voting. It's really fascinating, and it gets at an issue that like Mike said, you don't really think about, and that's literacy tests in New York that actually serve to harm Puerto Ricans. Okay, and of course, Puerto Ricans are American citizens, which is the other piece of the puzzle. So it's really fascinating thing that we do, but we'll leave that to the side. Just give me one moment to pull up. This is the congressional map for Virginia, and part of what I want to show you.
Sorry, Hank, we're not seeing that. You'd have to stop sharing this and then re.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. If you just reshare.
You guys see it now?
There you go. There you go.
Perfect.
That's it.
Okay. So these are the congressional districts in Virginia. Couple things you see with these congressional districts. One is you see, wow, some of these districts are much larger than others. Not a surprise because, of course, up in the Washington, D.C. area, you've got much more population. The other thing you see is that some of the districts look kind of strange. The 5th district, for example, and I realize that not a lot of folks necessarily know the geography of Virginia, but it's not terribly difficult to see that a district that stretches from the DC suburbs all the way down to the North Carolina border, while also essentially wrapping around another district, that doesn't look like a terribly compact district, right? And it's not. What is interesting is that this district is still considered to be sufficiently compact to be consistent with the Virginia State Constitution's requirement that districts be compact. Now, I don't want to say that this district is gerrymandered because there's a reason why this district was drawn. It's not necessarily that it was drawn in a way to guarantee that any particular individual win it or that either party win the district. It just happened to be drawn this way in part because it was left over from other districts that were drawn. Nonetheless, moving forward, I think it's fair to say that this district will likely be redrawn in 2021 when Virginia redistricts. I say a lot of this to say the process of redistricting and the process of voting and the process of determining who gets to represent whom has so many twists and turns that it will keep students thinking for years and years and years. And I hope your students have as much fun. Actually, I hope they have a smidgen as much fun with this stuff as I do, because if they do, they're going to have a great time. All right, I've gone a couple minutes over for that. I apologize, but I'll stop now and won't go over any longer. Thanks a bunch.
Well, thank you so much, Hank. We have questions. So let me just pull up some questions here. So Matt asks, what's the floor for voting nationwide? In other words, there's state control of voting laws, but is there, he wants to know, is there, I think what he's asking is, what should be the floor? What should be the basic standard for voting across the nation? And, you know, I mean, you could answer that from a factual basis too. Is there a floor right now? I mean, does it, you know?
Yeah, it's a great question because there are floors in two different ways, right? One floor is, what does the Constitution require? So the Constitution says, and here let's just talk about 18, right? The Constitution says you can't discriminate with respect to voting on the basis of age for anyone 18 and over. So that functionally says if you're 18, then you get to vote. Now, federal law then says, but in federal elections, you can't vote if you are under 18. Now, that being said, for states in their local elections, if they want to have a different rule, if they want to let 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds vote, they can do so in local elections. Now, if we wanted to go back and repeal the congressional limitation, at that point, then states might be allowed to allow 16, 17-year-olds to vote. So on age, it's kind of relatively clear where the lines are. A place where it's not clear is voting and felons, or voting, or let's say voting and offenders. So like I say, Maine and Vermont allow you to vote if you are actually incarcerated. Other states say not only can you not vote if you're incarcerated, you can't vote if you are under the criminal justice system, parole, probation, what have you. And some even say, even after that, you have to go to the governor and ask to have your voting rights restored. Right? There is no rule on that because the 14th Amendment has a little clause that seems to suggest that it's okay to disenfranchise people based on crime. So given that, that's why states can really do whatever they want when it comes to ex-offenders, folks along those lines.
Mm-hmm. And what is the role of nonpartisan districting commissions? I noticed where I live in California, we switched to the nonpartisan districting system recently, and it made a huge difference in my district. My congressional district became a lot more competitive, like, almost 50-50. Yeah, so what do you think about that? Is that a solution to this districting problem in America?
So it actually raises an interesting question. Nonpartisan redistricting depends largely on what it is the jurisdiction wants to do. So let me suggest this. California's an interesting example. I'm not sure what your district is like, but it's not clear to me that a competitive district is better than a non-competitive district, depending on who lives in the district. That is, if the goal is, we just want to have horse races, well, that doesn't impress me as a basis for redistricting. California is clearly going to send a Democratic delegation to Washington. Right? There's no question about that. So the question becomes, how democratic should it be? Or to put it slightly differently, for what reasons do we provide representation? That is, it may well be that where you live, you shouldn't have a competitive district, right? Or at least it may be that the way that the district becomes competitive is to frankly engage in gerrymandering to guarantee competition. Gerrymandering to guarantee competition doesn't strike me as being a whole lot different than gerrymandering for other reasons. So that's part of the question. Now, if for whatever reason California wants to have competitive districts, great. But it does seem to me that in a wave election, it may well be that there's a much larger change than there should be based on the numbers of of relative Democrats, Republicans, what have you in the jurisdiction. But hey, if California wants to do something wacky, that's good for them. In a state that's more purple, right? In a state that's purely purple, you talk about fun. Have about 80% of your districts be 50-50. Watch a wave election come and see craziness occur. I'm all for a good horse race, but it would be kind of interesting to see what would happen if a legislature flipped in a wave election, and I mean flipped hard in a wave election. It's not clear to me that that's really what states want, but hey, if states do want that, good for them. I'll just pop some popcorn and watch what goes on election night.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Professor Chambers. I really appreciate your presentation tonight. And everyone, just continue to leave your questions in the chat, and we will get to them as time permits. But
Fabulous.
So now we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Emma Humphries. Emma is the Chief Education Officer of iCivics. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Mark. Wow, I have learned so much. That's great. Thank you everyone for hanging around. I know how late it is, especially if you're on the East Coast like I am. I am joined this evening by our incredible curriculum associate, Molly Lonsford. She will be working the chat. So any questions you have about any of the resources I'm sharing, by the way, she created most of them. Any questions about iCivics more generally, don't hesitate to put them in there. You won't be distracting me. Molly will be helping away. We also have Kristen, our incredible senior advisor and ELL coordinator. So any questions you have about our ELL resources for English language learners, Kristen can answer those too. And I know we have some Educator Network members joining us this evening. So don't be shy in the chat. And you'll see here in a second, my presentation style tends to be a little on the flip side. So let's have some fun. It's late, and let me go ahead and get started. So right out of the gate, if you don't already have a free iCivics teacher account, go ahead and create one. I start every presentation this way. It's just so that you can access everything. You don't have to have an account. You can jump on, you can search around, you can hit play, win the White House, try to win the White House. But if you want to get to all those great resources, you got to have that free teacher account. So go ahead and do that if you haven't done so already. So my name is Emma. I'm the Chief Education Officer for iCivics, an organization that was founded by retired Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. We are most known for our games. We have 16 role-playing games, and those games are what really put us on the map. So when I talk to people, I say, absolutely, go to iCivics.org, hit play some of our games, but you should stick around for the over 250 other resources we have on our site, which now includes our Tough and Timely infographic series. And that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. And not all of them. I'm going to really sort of refine my remarks to the ones that are related to tonight's topic, which is voting rights and representation. So with that, let me sort of say my piece here. I used to be a high school civics and government teacher. I used to be a We the People teacher, by the way. And so like most social studies teachers, I have my shticks. I have my things that I really love to talk about, love to go on a tear about. I love to go on a tear about how we let Iowa, New Hampshire determine who our nominees are for presidential candidates. And, I ask people do you know anyone from Iowa or New Hampshire? And yeah, me neither. Just kidding. I know Stephanie Wager, the new NCSS president. She's from Iowa. But anyways, that's one of my shticks. Another one is all about representation. And what I want to say to you today is that representation matters. I'm making the case with some old school iCivics bobbleheads. For those of you who've known us for some time, you'll recognize these old bobbleheads from our original games. But representation matters a whole lot, and it matters in some pretty obvious ways, some ways really related to tonight's discussion, and it matters in some different ways that are sort of embedded in these topics and American society, particularly in this moment. So I think representation matters in terms of people seeing themselves in different bodies, be they legislative or not. Representation matters to me when I look at Congress and I see other women there, I can see myself in that Congress, and my two daughters can do so as well. Representation matters in terms of people believing that the government represents them, that their identities, their beliefs, their values are reflected in the people who have been elected to make decisions on their behalf. It matters to believe that those people care about some of the same things you care about, and they're going to do whatever they can to promote those issues. And this whole point of representation brings us to a really fun and enduring debate in American politics, one of my favorite things to talk about, which is what kind of government do we have in the United States? And you know, this should be the easiest question in the world. Everyone should get this right. There should be no debate over it. But you know, everything's a wedge issue, particularly during a presidential election year. So let's make it a debate. What kind of government do we have in the United States? Well, it depends who you ask. And if you ask a Democrat, you might get one answer. And you ask a Republican, you might get a different answer. And if you ask a social studies teacher, you'll probably get a really long answer that's very different from the other two. And so here are some examples of what you might hear. It's a democracy. No, it's a republic. And then there's that social studies teacher. You clearly didn't pay attention in class. It's a democratic republic. So if you asked me, Emma, and by the way, I get asked this question a lot, do we have a democracy or a republic? I always give the same answer. Because we have both. It's the same thing. It's different, it's semantics, there's some nuance, but it's a democratic republic, fine, but a republic is a democracy, it's a form of a democracy. So, you know, it's both. We don't need to lose sleep over this. And I know who I'm talking to. I know y'all. I know you guys get into big heated debates over this, and I'm here to say, knock it off. Just, it's both. It's fine. It's fine. So call it whatever you want. Call it a democracy, a republic, a democratic republic, a constitutional democracy, a representative democracy, a three-ring circus. All of these are accurate. And if any American gives me any of these answers, I'm going to say, that's right. So at the end of the day, what really matters is representation. That we vote for people who represent us, that our voice, the voice of we the people, is reflected in our government. That is democratic and it is Republican. Little d, little r. It's a beautiful thing. So let's talk about the resources that iCivics has that will help us teach this important concept in the classroom. So we have 3 infographics I'd like to highlight tonight. The first one is in honor of the Women's Centennial, the 19th Amendment Centennial, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. Of course, not all women. Talk about that more in a second. I've already talked about that a little bit in Mike's presentation, which was amazing, by the way. Another infographic on this topic is on the census, our new plug into power, teaching the census infographic. And our very new, brand new, just got published a few days ago, Where Do We Draw the Line? And Valerie, I promised that we had Michigan in there. You'll see the glove down there, glove, at the bottom there on the right. All right, so where do you find these and what do we do with them? Okay, so you go to www.icivics.org. You will see this. You can click on our elections headquarters. You'll find them there. You can do a few ways, but you're all teachers. So I say click teach, and that'll bring you to our teach hub, which looks like this. And then you can scroll down to the unit where you might find one of these topics, or you could just type the word infographic into that content search bar, and you will be brought to a screen that looks like this. And you can scroll down and come to the infographic that you want. You can click view, you'll see the objectives. You won't be able to download anything though if you don't have that free teacher account. So make sure you have that. Okay, so that's how you get to it. So let's say we're gonna go ahead and click on that first one, a movement in the right direction. And we're gonna take a closer look at this women's suffrage infographic. Now, we don't just make these things because they're beautiful, although I do think they're gorgeous and I do think they make incredible classroom decorations. But we also make them to be teaching tools. And they're teaching tools for the public and they're teaching tools for our students. And so we provide resources to help you teach with them. like a Teaching with Infographics guide. So every infographic has this guide. The first page will look like what you see here, talking about what is an infographic, why they're important, what are some best practices for teaching, and some general activity ideas. And then on the second page of each individual infographic teaching guide, you'll find a page that is specific to the actual infographic that you're teaching with. So we provide some vocabulary, we sort of show you where to focus students' attention as you're teaching with this resource, and provide some nice discussion prompts, etc. So that's our women's suffrage movement infographic. We made this earlier in the calendar year, before 2020 was hashtag 2020. Looking back on it now, Molly and I think, agree it was a missed opportunity to make a point about how wonderful this amendment is, but where it fell short, and how we need to be careful when we say things, general blanket statements like the 19th Amendment gave all women the right to vote, because that's not really true. It's not factually incorrect to say that it granted women the right to vote, but there's some big asterisks there, and I think more and more we want to be calling those out, and I'll show you how we do that in just a second. So let's talk about our next infographic, Plug into Power. Just like with the first one I showed you, the suffrage one, it will come with that guide, and it will have that page that, again, gives you those specific resources for teaching about the census. You can then take this right into a mini lesson that we created on teaching about the census. So again, it's not just beautiful poster art for your classroom, it's also a teaching tool, and we provide resources to guide you in that. So this is me just sort of focusing in more on what that second page looks like. Again, we're focusing you in on certain features of the infographic, making sure you know which base knowledge your kids will need before learning about it, and again, providing those questions. We also have the mini lesson. These are all now, you can print them out. If you're in the classroom, you can print them out, you can make copies. They're also fillable PDFs. And so all of these places where a student would normally write, they can now type. So if you're teaching virtually, or teaching hybrid, or you just want to send this home for virtual homework, your kids can fill these out as fillable PDFs. Okay, so last but not least, our newest infographic, one I'm most excited about, giving myself a time check. Okay, gerrymandering, where do we draw the line? So unlike the women's suffrage infographic, we started making this infographic after 2020 became hashtag 2020. After George Floyd's murder, after Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor became household names. And we decided that it wasn't enough for us to just say, like, here's gerrymandering, here's how it works, that we wanted to be a little bit more transparent and speak to the ways in which it can affect power and it can affect representation, particularly in terms of race and ethnicity. So we put this in here. This was not easy to do because we wanted to get it right. We didn't want to make broad sweeping statements. We didn't want to get anything that wasn't constitutionally accurate or accurate in terms of Supreme Court precedent. So this wasn't easy to do, and major kudos to Molly for really taking the time to flesh this out and to speak to different scholars and experts to make sure that we got this right. So just to focus you in here on some points, you'll see here how we're telling you what redistricting, we're telling students, right? Helping students understand what redistricting is, what gerrymandering is, but then also sort of drawing that line, making that connection to the ways in which it affects representation of communities of color. We then show, there's Michigan. We then show what cracking is and what packing, these two common forms of gerrymandering. So, sticking right to the facts, this is what it is. But again, the result, oftentimes people of color are isolated to one district or spread out so that they don't even get a representative. This is all very complicated, and I don't think it's enough to just say, hey kids, here's an infographic, go figure it out, right? So again, we want to provide that guidance and provide those resources to help students make sense of this and to treat it as a true inquiry activity. And again, here at the very end, infographic, right? The point is to more visual, less text, try to explain this in limited text. It's really not easy, particularly when you have to look at multiple Supreme Court decisions to figure out exactly what the law is. And that's why at the end, we say it's complicated, because it really is. And that's one of the most exhausting things about teaching American government, and also one of the most exhilarating things about teaching American government. So just want to close by saying that you can find all these resources and more at our elections headquarters. We've sort of put everything in one place, one-stop shopping. I know it's a really tough year to be teaching about the election. I know it's a really tough year to be teaching about any contentious issue like racial gerrymandering, or the impact that gerrymandering has on communities of color and their representation. But listen, if these kids aren't having these opportunities to talk about and investigate these concepts in your classroom, then where are they going to have them? So I implore you to do so, although you have all my empathy and understanding that it's really tough to do it. I know you're not just talking to your kids, sometimes you're broadcasting into their homes as well, and that can be really scary. All of our games can be played on iPads and tablets. They all can be downloaded for free. And I just want to make a point to show you that we've recently upgraded 6 of our games. So our 2 elections related games, Win the White House, Cast Your Vote, they have been upgraded in the past year. They have been translated into Spanish, so you can play in either language. And it's a great thing to like create a leaderboard and have kids sort of duke it out to try to get at the top. What I like to do is play first and get a really high score and post that and tell the kids that they've got to try to beat me, and they're always going to beat you, and they're going to keep playing and keep playing and keep playing until they do so. Thank you so much. This has been such a treat, such an honor to present alongside the Center for Civic Education, a master teacher like Mike, and a master scholar like Hank. This is really, truly a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much, Emma. As usual, iCivics has lit up the chat. I don't know how you do it, but you do it. And, you know, Molly has been sharing all kinds of resources. We've got Nearpod lessons, Google Classroom Clever. This is amazing. And it's free. It's free. Yeah. So you just sign up for that account. I would like to take this opportunity, if you don't mind, to do some shameless plugging. First of all, I'd like to start with 60 Seconds Civics. This is the Center for Civic Education's daily podcast. It's perfect for middle school classrooms. And we're doing a special series on the elections leading up to the, all this month leading up to the election. And basically we've got a daily civics quiz here. And the idea is that you listen to the podcast, then you take the quiz, or that your kids do, actually. You can do it yourself as well. It's a good idea. We also have this playlist here, which is all of the episodes, and the newest episode is always loaded in every day. Now, Emma mentioned the 19th Amendment earlier. So I would just like to, and you know, how it's worded and whether or not it, you know, actually gave all women the right to vote, which it did not. I would just like to plug this. This is at our Power to the People series. And this particular episode, which took place, this webinar, which took place last Thursday, goes really deeply into the 19th Amendment and the struggle to pass it. It's by Lisa Tatro at Carnegie Mellon. And we have more of these. We have a total of 7. And the next one is Thursday. It's coming right up. And this is about symbols, monuments and flags by Brandon Hasbrook at Washington Lee University Law School. So, do you have any further comments before we sign off tonight?
Just want to thank everyone out there fighting the good fight. Teaching civics in 2020 is challenging. And I agree with Emma. It's all about this to all of us that are out there every day. And shout out to Brad, who I know from the We the People Institute, who's one of my favorite people to see every year. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. One of the pluses is that the Constitution comes alive literally every day. And norms are being challenged and broken every day. And explaining norms to kids and asking them what norms are good and what norms can be broken has got to be an awful lot of fun, if not painful.
I'm sure there's a little bit of both. Well, thank you so much, everybody. And with that, we will sign off. Good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. This was
Thank
great.
you. Wonderful. Thanks. Bye.